Right. Now so alien and unnatural after all, the role of privation and deification in Augustine's sermons. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Rosenberg?
Okay, now we can set the hype aside. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for that generous and kind introduction on many levels. I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful to be here now. As you heard, I've been involved in this for a number of years. And when I was part of the North American Society conferences in the late 80s, early 90s, I was one of 2, 3, or 4 people out of 200 who I at least knew to be connected in some way to the evangelical tradition. We were not a dime a dozen, we were a diamond a dozen. It was hard to come by, and I think had anybody at that time suggested to me that Wheaton College, of all places, would have a Center for Patristic Study, I would have been the first to be picking up the stone for the false prophet. So it's with amazing shock and real delight that I'm here to join you tonight, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And to speak to you, I think, which is an important topic. Privation and deification. I'm delighted to see an audience interested in those two words. Those are two key words. Well, I suppose Augustine is kind of an important word in there as well. So maybe you came for Augustine, maybe deification or privation. Might just help if along the way here, I'll use this, that's appropriate. We get some definitions just to make sure everybody's on the same plane, and I'll do that in due course. So if you're wondering what these funny words are, we'll make sure that we cover that. But I think first I want to point to this photo, this image of this famous painting. This is really an important painting, both in art history. It's also a very important painting to me personally. As I did my doctorate at Catholic University on Augustine's Cosmology. Cosmology is late antique metaphysics wrapped up in broader ideas of the universe. It's not modern cosmology. You think of somebody who's doing astronomy. This is not astronomy. This is much more philosophy and metaphysics of the nature of the world. So as I was working on my doctorate on late antique cosmology, I printed this out. I had a large print of this sitting above my desk to inspire me. So for anyone who's interested in ancient science, so my work was working on Augustine's use of Greco-Roman science and his interpretations of Genesis. And this image is red meat to someone like me. So here you've got astrolabes. So those were very important tools for plotting stars, for plotting a path. You wouldn't have had the New World discovered without these. You have an armillary sphere. Anyone's familiar with Ptolemy, who first created this in the 2nd century and continued as well through the medieval period. Can't really see it. Down here is a nocturnal, and there's an hourglass. All of these are implements for science, and really important implements in the history of science. And there you have Augustine, who really drew upon it much, and you get a sense of what a Renaissance vision of an informed bishop would be. It would be interesting to see. You wouldn't expect to see an image quite like this these days if you wanted to see what a knowledgeable churchman looked like. You can quite probably see all these symbols applied. Well, I came across this painting first under a different title. And the title was Augustine and His Study. That's not the proper title. The title that I learned it by, that was first presented in the book that I came across, and it was Augustine and His Study. And in it was about 2000, I went to Venice and was able to see this painting in situ, to go to the School of the Donation Sailors and see. Has anyone ever been to Venice and seen this in this room? It's an amazing painting. It's a really interesting painting. And that painting, when I went to see it, became a really important teaching moment for me when I was forced to remember my father was a medievalist, and he used to say to me, Stan, a text without a context is a pretext. And Jeff knew my father. He's probably heard my dad say that. This was his watchword almost. I'm sure he whispered it to me when I was from a baby on. And then you think about being a teenager coming home and arguing with your father, and I'm sure he pulled it out at those times as well. Well, this was a good chance for me to see the wisdom of those words. Because I got there, and I discovered this painting which inspired me as I did my doctorate. It sat above my desk as I beavered away on a really difficult dissertation with lots of secondary sources I had to manage and all sorts of funny language stuff. I got there, and I saw it, and I discovered that this image really has nothing to do with Augustine. Augustine is not the subject here. First off, I discovered that the title by which I knew it, Augustine's study, was wrong. This is the proper title, the Visione, the Vision of Augustine. So that's the proper title of it, that Carpaccio intended. The second thing I learned when I got there and saw it in situ is it's a very large painting, probably about 4 times the size of this screen. It's like these find in many of these Renaissance chapels. And it's in this chapel, it's in a cycle of 10 paintings, or is it 12? I don't remember if it's 10 or 12, but in a cycle of paintings on the life of Jerome. So the subject of this painting is not really Augustine, but Jerome. This is the penultimate painting in this cycle. And the image before this, immediately before this, is the death of Jerome. Now, if any of you know, have studied or come across this period and worked with this, you would know, perhaps, that Jerome and Augustine didn't always get on. It was not the easiest of relationships. Augustine was the young, world-class thinker. Jerome was the very studious, world-class scholar, philologist, who created the Vulgate and critical commentaries, an amazing, prodigious scholar, a great linguist who was concerned about precision, and Augustine was not always so precise. And they had a very uneasy relationship. Both knew each other, never knew each other, wrote to each other. There's some famous instances where one of Augustine's letters criticizing Jerome, as what happened in ancient days, was supposed to have been delivered to Jerome, but sort of cycled its way around the Mediterranean before it finally got to Jerome. And it had all sorts of criticisms of Jerome in it, and Jerome didn't find this to be an appropriate way to handle the relationship. So it was a difficult relationship. The painting just before this, I told you, was Jerome's death. This is Augustine, the vision of Augustine. This is Augustine hitting word. Either, I'm not sure if Carpaccio meant that they just read something. It could be they just read and he's writing out, or if he's had some sort of revelation of it. But he's just learned of Jerome's death, and he's reflecting on this very uneasy relationship. So this is a painting, yes, about Augustine, but not about Augustine. It's about this relationship, about this structure. And that's why I think it's really emblematic of many of the things we have to contend with. And what I want to suggest to you as we work with today, with this topic tonight, on the nature of atonement and the history of the doctrine of atonement, that the image is not always what we think. So a potted history, if you picked up any potted history of theology, or almost any potted history of theology, you would hear something like this, or read, rather, something like this, since we're literate, not in oral culture. You would read something like this, that in the doctrine of atonement, the West emphasized, and Augustine would have been the great proponent of this, and really led the way, emphasized ransom or captivity theory, so focusing on Christ coming to set us free from Satan and ransoming us, paying the price. The East, now, and this would be a Western approach to it, the East, they taught a very funny kind of idea called theosis, or the Latin, somewhat near translation, Latin translation, or near translation of that is deification, deificatio. That is God, and it comes from this phrase, first coined in some ways by Irenaeus, that God became man, that man could become like unto God. Now, deification emphasizes this notion that we are transformed, and in that transformation, that grace infuses within us. Righteousness comes in, infuses us, and begins this process of conversion, of transformation, that renews us and makes us more and more into the image and likeness of God over time. Now, it's not in any way predicating ontologically we become very God, but our nature is being made manifest into that which it was intended to be. So this is theosis, or deificatio. But Augustine didn't do that. That's the funny thing that they did in the East. So you could read that if you pick up the Systematic Theology by Millard Erickson, you read that. If you pick up the 3-volume Integrative Theology, I can't remember who did that, and the big 3-volume gets around a lot of our schools. Yeah. Same exact position taken there. If you pick up Karl Barth, he says quite the same thing. So that's the common vision. What I want to suggest to you is when we approach this doctrine, or this teaching, I think we need to carry my discovery about this painting in mind. That it's not always what it seems, and we need to get into it and see the material for what it is, see it in its context, and see the right context, the right set of materials in order to judge this. And what I want to suggest to you is, in our understanding of Western theology, Augustine in particular, but actually much more broader, it's not just Augustine, that potted history that I just suggested to you is absolutely wrong. And in fact, if you pay attention to this closely in the broader history of theology, you'll find that people are saying the same thing of Calvin and Luther these days, in fact. That there is a broader rethinking going on in terms of Reformation theology. This is something that actually is a transformation that went on under the scholastic reformers. And what many of us have, or at least at one point or another, take it for granted as a natural inheritance, is actually a genetic mutation of sorts. And we have to pay attention to those mutations so we can discover where we ought to be. So, let me take us into this. Well, just a quick reminder of, and I hope that you discover something more of real Augustine. I was able to go and see this famous fresco last spring. This is a fresco of Augustine, and that would have been in Gregory the Great's palace, the Lateran Palace in Rome. If you've been to Rome, this is underneath the Church of the Holy Steps across from San Giovanni. So this is, it's an archaeological dig built there. This has been probably either a library or chapel, uncertain what its original purpose of the room was. And this is the earliest image we have of Augustine. Perhaps, can we turn this light off so people can see it better? Is there a, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Perhaps that's actually an image of Augustine, because Augustine would have had a signet ring with his image engraved on it. And so there's some suggestion, it's a suggestion, not certain, that that this was taken from that ring. We don't have strong, direct evidence of that. There's some indirect suggestion of that. So it's interesting. That might be. It's certainly representative of what Augustine would have looked like. We get a feel for it, even if that's not the actual image. So Augustine delivered to us, we have 93 of his 94 books that he wrote. By the way, you'll see different numbers given for the number of books that Augustine wrote. Some people will say up to 120. That's because some of his letters were so long that we're inclined to call them books. So things that he thought of his books, 94 written, 93 of them still extant. That's an amazing data set for anyone working in the team. But even more amazing and interesting to work with is that Augustine delivered somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 sermons, of which we have that number, right? I was on the airplane when I did that. I don't know what I was thinking. It's about 950 sermons that are extant. So, sorry, X that out. So about 950 sermons extant, which is, again, for a late antique scholar, that's just a stunning data set to work with. And that's going to be important for some issues I want to bring to our attention. For those of you not familiar with Augustine, I'll just do this very briefly. Others of you will know of Augustine, but here's just, you can read it for yourself, but there's just his basic dates to put him into context. That he is born while Christianity is a favored religion, so after the time of Constantine, made both legal and favored. And during his life and during his adult life, Christianity made the official state religion under Theodosius the Great, with some important moments of transformation, steps along the way, such as when the change of the emperor giving up the title of Pontifex Maximus, other important moments along the way. But Augustine is there during this core time of sometimes what we refer to as Christianization, but a real transformation of the empire and a significant rethinking of the relationship. There you've got the dates of some of his important books and the key debates that we remember him for. Now, here's what I'm telling you where we're going with this so you can track the argument. I don't want to surprise you with the argument. I'm going to give you what my core argument is, then I'm going to go through the evidence, and you can judge whether that evidence fits. So, I'm going to talk first about the importance of sermons. The data set I'm going to work with and want to convince you, I hope I leave you convinced by that we need to pay more attention to our sermons and what that can tell us about Augustine and his theology and the importance for late antiquity. Secondly, I want to look at Augustine's cosmology because it's such a core part of his thought. And that what I want to suggest is you can't really come to grips with any key aspect of Augustine theology without paying attention to his cosmology. And thirdly, I want to look at his way of handling the problem of evil as a privatio boni, which again, what I want to suggest to you is you cannot manage any key aspect of his theology without reference to this way of understanding the problem of evil. I can't think of a work of Augustine's I've read, beyond a short fragment of a sermon or a short letter, where he doesn't touch in some way on privatio boni. It is so deeply embedded in his mental construct, his mental world. And to construct a theological assessment of Augustine without reference to this is to make a significant mistake. So, I've already said this, but let's just come back to this. The old model. So what I'm going to do is critique the old model, that deification, deificatio, to give it the Latin word, its proper Latin form, is alien to the Latin West, something unnatural. And that's actually, some of you will recognize that was a particular choice of words to call it something natural versus unnatural, because nature is so important to Augustine. This has been the general view, though in the 20th century there were 4 different people that have written on this. My mentor, Gerald Bonner, and a great Jesuit scholar, Roman Tesky. There were 2 Spanish articles. That was from between 4 articles. You have to understand, Greg and I will know this. Like when I don't know how many secondary sources you had for your dissertation. When I did my dissertation on Augustine, this is foolish. When I did my dissertation, doing a dissertation on Augustine is kind of foolish. I had somewhere close to 500 secondary sources I had to manage. That's why it was foolish. My best friend in graduate school had hardly any because he dealt with minor prophets, and he dealt with minor prophets and patristics. So there's some guidance for those of you who are thinking about dissertations. To find a topic where only 4 articles in a century written on the subject related to Augustine is shocking. It's just, it tells you something is going on. Something is missing. We're missing something. If only 4 people have picked up on this. And one of them, my mentor Gerald Bonner, was one of the premier Augustine scholars of the last century. His biography of Augustine is still a standard that ought to be engaged with. And for him to write on it, and no one else picked it up, it's just really surprising. So that tells you, wait a minute, we've got to think about what's going on here. Why is this not being thought about? Is there something that's getting in the way? I had an article on this beginning part of this century in about 2000, 2001. And then, again, nothing until there's just been a book out by a monograph on Marconi taking up this issue. So it's not touched much. Not really gone through. That's just beginning to change. I'm participating in a book project at Oxford that's reacting to working with this, but outside of that, not many. So when something doesn't show up, you have to ask why. Well, I've already talked about this, potted histories. What I want to suggest to you, why has this not been touched? Well, it has to do with how we think about data. Late antiquity was an oral culture built on a literate, or built on a textual framework. So there were stories, there were texts there, but it was an oral culture. And interestingly, we have not really paid close attention to what it means to be an oral culture. And here by we, I mean late antique and patristic scholars. It's not something we spend much time thinking about or talking about. It's really rare to find, actually, which is really surprising given how much our colleagues in other allied disciplines have thought about this, like classics and medieval studies, where they have given real serious attention. And I think by doing this, we've failed to position these works and to think about the writings of someone like Augustine or Ambrose or the Cappadocians in a context that's meaningful and makes sense, that understands them in their world. To do history of a time and period well, you have to have a kind of empathy for it. You need to be able to enter into that world. I may not be able to enter fully into the patristic mindset of the patristic world, but if I can't imagine, if I can't get my mind into it, I can't actually tell a good job of unraveling their story, of giving a narrative that's meaningful. And so what we've ended up doing, by failing to situate it in their own time, we have read a doctrine through its later development and iteration and read back into it some notion of earlier views. So we have picked up there is some movement, there's a greater emphasis. For example, some of you who do medieval theology will know that Anselm really, in some ways, although not as much as often pushed or suggested, promoted satisfaction, which is in a way tied to ransom theory or captivity. And then we look at the reformers like Luther and Calvin, who talk about this, although not as much as people wish them to. As in, there's actually more deification there to be found. And then we look at the scholastic reformers who really did make ransom theory the core and center, and we read it back into later works as if it was always there. And one of the ways we do that, and particularly, for example, some of you may know the work of Gustav Allun, Karl Barth does this as well, is they pay attention to the wrong thing. So they should have perhaps paid attention to my father. A text without a context is a pretext. That we need to read and pay attention to the whole material. I'm not a great chess player, so my chess playing friends will really laugh at me for using this analogy. But those of you who play chess know that one of the key mistakes is not watching the whole board. If you don't play the whole board, you're going to miss that move or two moves or three moves out that are coming, and you're prone to make a mistake. You have to watch the whole board. Well, you have to watch the whole set of materials. In our case, what we're doing as scholars. You have to look at all the materials available. And Allun and Karl Barth, and others, they're not alone in this, I'm just picking them out, didn't play the whole board. What were they doing? They were looking at a particular set of materials. They were looking primarily at books, as if books represented the whole of what Augustine thought. What did Augustine write in his books? And they were preoccupied with several books because they thought of Augustine controversialist who was preoccupied with Pelagianism. And so they read primarily his anti-Pelagian writings, where you find ransom theory, and they read only his books, primarily his books. Or if they read the other bits, they didn't pay that much attention to it. They didn't play the whole board. And so that text focused them in a way that was wrong. So they ignored key constituent parts. Now think about those numbers I presented earlier. 93 books, maybe as many as 10,000 sermons. Let's go with the lower number, 4,000 sermons. Where's the bulk of Augustine's work found? Well, that's an easy question, right? It's his sermons. They've missed the implications by looking at the wrong materials, looking at the wrong places. They're preoccupied by books. Well, they're not the only ones. It's interesting just to pay attention. If you look at the iconography of Augustine, well, there's that fresco again. There's Augustine with a book. Or here's Augustine with a book inside a book. This is a front piece of the folio of the City of God. Or here's Augustine on a Botticelli, again with a book. Or there's Augustine with a book. You guys getting a trajectory of thought here? Here's Botticelli. Yet again, Botticelli. Augustine was a great image for Botticelli. He had masses and numbers of Augustine images. Here's Augustine with a book and a really wonderful Renaissance book stand. That's an image you can go see in Florence. This is when he doesn't have a book. I just put in. This is Augustine, the hammer of God against Pelagius. There's Giotto presenting what here's Augustine who hammers Pelagius. So one of the things I want to suggest to you is we are conditioned because we live in a literate culture. We are surrounded by books. We live with books, whether they be in paper form or they're a digital form. We're both a typographical, a geographical, and basically, of course, a digitalized version of that culture. And so if you ask any of my Oxford colleagues, what do they see when they see here? Oh, so Josh, what's the first thing you see here?
The Bodleian.
The Bodleian. So this is the Bodleian Library. Josh was one of our students in Oxford, Richie as well. You walk down, most of my Oxford colleagues would think when they see this, okay, I'm next to the Bodleian. We are also next to the University Church, which is right next to it, where preaching happens. We are so conditioned, we are socialized to think about books because we are a literate culture, and books are what shape us, the way we think about knowledge. Yet we shouldn't be doing that when we think about late antique world. We have to transform and change what we think is important, where we go for material. So play the whole board. We are conditioned to look at books. Well, we need to remember that pedagogy in the late antique world was something very different. I'm going to go in a different order than what I have on there. It's not unusual to find, particularly amongst a set of scholars, late antique historians, the notion that something along these lines. Late antique society was largely illiterate. Harris, in his book on ancient literacy, posits literacy rates of between 7 and 15% in the Roman world. So that's very low. And from that, people have said, people like Ferdinand Lowe and Ramsay MacMullen at Yale argue that these people were so illiterate, these sermons, there's something wrong. Because you read these sermons, like you read Augustine's sermons, you read Basil's sermons, you read some very sophisticated theology. You read some very tight-knit arguments. And their response is, well, this is an illiterate culture. How could they have understood their bishops preaching to them? These great writers trained in the rhetorical schools, or you read Gregory of Nazianzus. How could they have understood them? Is their argument. And so they say either A, these bishops actually didn't know anything about what was in their congregation. So they're up here talking, not realizing they have a bunch of, and these are their words, a bunch of rustic farmers who couldn't understand a bit of their soaring language. So that's option A. Or option B, you really had fairly educated people in the audience, and they're the only ones who came. And when Augustine or Chrysostom or Basil talk about the poor in their congregation, it's actually they don't even know what's going on, or they're just using them as a type, but not in any kind of reality. They have fundamentally presumed something critical here, that rationality and literacy go together, because they are thinking about what works in our world. So we live in a world that is the modern West, where you can, to an extent, make that argument, that if you aren't literate, you aren't going to be as rational. Now there's a lot that can be argued about that one as well, of course. But there's a reason to say that if somebody hasn't had a chance at books, perhaps it's not going to be as, because that's how knowledge is produced in our society. But that's not how knowledge was produced and shaped in their society, number one. Number two, they assume that of a flat experience, a flat society, that is pagans and Christians and Jews all had something similar. And that's not true. We know that the pagan society didn't pay much attention to pedagogy amongst the populace. Now, they wanted a few slaves who were educated who could read to them. So Cicero talks about having friends over for dinner and having the slave read to them. So you would have an educated slave, but you didn't think beyond having a few well-trained slaves who were educated. There wasn't a vision or a particular purpose of educating a broad populace. Now think about both the synagogue and the church. You had liturgy, you had lexical readings, you had catechesis, you had sermons, sometimes daily, you had hymns, you had artwork. You wouldn't know that from Augustine, by the way. You think Augustine was Dutch Reformed. They had all these tools, these structures within the context of an oral culture that were forms of education. And Augustine thought about that and used that. He talked in one of his sermons. It was one of his Interratios on the Psalms. He says, "Go away and think about this. Understand this. What you don't understand it, well, let us be your book. Listen to us. Let us who read be your book." So he was aware of this. He built a chapel in memory of Stephen, the proto-martyr, after his sometime disciple, Orosius, brought the relics back from Jerusalem. This was about 315, 318. So he built this chapel. And he had scripture written up on the walls. Presumably, we don't know, but presumably this would have been the text out of Acts about Stephen's martyrdom. And he says, let this little room, even if you can't read these texts, let us read it to you and let this room be your book. So there's a conscious sense going on within the church society, and Augustine's not alone, as you can find this in Chrysostom and others. There's this conscious sense that they were a pedagogical vision for the broad masses, unlike what you would find in pagan culture. And so when you read the works of, like Ramsay MacMullen's 1989 article, The Preacher's Audience, he completely misses that there is this dynamic, that there is this focused attention, and that there's an oral culture. So really, what I want to suggest to you is literacy or illiteracy doesn't actually tell you what they knew. It only tells you the condition by which they knew or might know. It doesn't actually tell you anything substantive about what you can assume about the knowledge base of the people. Does that make sense? I also want to suggest that we need to rethink what we call normal. So a typical way of thinking is that books are the normal mode of access, the normal material. If you want to get to know somebody's thought, you go to their books. If you want to get to know Augustine, you go to his books. I want to suggest to you that in the context of an oral culture, it's maybe not his books you should go to primarily for Augustine, but his sermons. Let me take that a step further. It's even his books you have to understand in a different way, because you know how Augustine wrote. Not like you and I wrote. He dictated. He had a secretary, a notary. He would dictate out a book, chapter by chapter, or section by section, really, not chapter. Then he would, after he finished the section he felt was that got to a direction amount that he wanted, he'd have the secretary read back to him what was written down, what was dictated, and he would recite then corrections one time. So one set of verbal edits. All of this is verbal, so this is all itself happening in a context of a kind of oral culture. Books are themselves an oral product. One of the things that Greg and I have to deal with, we're often finding apparent contradictions or real contradictions in Augustine to try and make sense of it. And you get people trying to figure out, how could Augustine said this in one place? And I can't think of an example of this right at the moment. He'll contradict himself and think, how did he do this? It's because we expect Augustine, because we think about books, we think about books the way we write them, we expect Augustine to have editorial control of his writings in a way that we do. When you write a 2,000-word essay, how many edits do you bring to bear in that 2,000-word essay? Hundreds? Multiple hundreds? You're hoping more. Or fearing less and hoping more. Every time you hit backspace, that's an edit, right? For Augustine, spoken once, heard back once, typically one set of verbal edits back, done. So if he contradicts or he says something or he doesn't recite it, and he's doing a lot of this from memory, so you get him reciting passages of Scripture from memory, which then look a little bit different. Sometimes they look different because he's got the old North African Latin text. Sometimes they're different because he's going from memory. And sometimes he remembers it wrong. So what I want to suggest to you, when we think about what defines a person's corpus of writings, what we think of as being normal, we need to rethink if we're working with an oral culture. We're conditioned to books, we go to the books. This is what so when I've said that people who have misunderstood Augustine, that they weren't paying attention, part is because their idea of what's normal were the books. So they went to the books. You can see the argument for it, right? But they went to the books. If you want to understand what Augustine had to say about ransom theory, we'll go to his anti-Pelagian works, where that's a big issue. You get ransom theory there. But is that the whole Augustine? Well, it's obvious that Augustine didn't think that way. He thought of his sermons as being, for example, being important and appropriate for forms of sophisticated teaching. He talks about one of his, in his Retractationes, this was a set of reflections he did at the end, towards the end of his life, going back over all of his works. And he says that on his anti-Manichaean works that he had a set of sermons that he wrote, that he gave against one of the disciples of Mani, Adeimantus. And they were given in sermons, so he didn't need to put into a book. He thought it was actually quite important. He describes in one of his epistles, he describes the churches as the sacred lecture halls for the people. I've already told you this one. For those unable or unwilling to read, let us be their book. He had, in terms of his pedagogical vision in oral context, he had the minutes of the Council of Carthage, just as one of the important moments in terms of the Donatist debate in North Africa. He had the minutes as well as his own personal notes from the council read to the church, to his churches. He wanted them to be brought into it. And I don't think I have this one up here, but in another place, he argues that there should be a debate between the Donatist bishop in Hippo and himself in public because he thought the people ought to hear both sides and ought to be aware of both sides of the argument. So there's obviously a commitment to pedagogy that's extensive, expansive, and oral. And that's what we need to pay attention to. So that's, pay attention to the sermons. If you pay attention, and we're going to come to sermons, actual sermons in a bit. That's the first point. Second is we need to pay attention to his cosmology. Again, I want to suggest to you, any of you interested in Augustine, I don't think you will make reasonable heads or tails of his theology if you don't pay attention to both cosmology and Privation theory. Otherwise, you miss things. So, we find in Augustine that he had a preoccupation with Genesis, 5 different commentaries. So my area of work has been focusing on his major commentary, the final one. Well, it wasn't the final one, the final set piece of commentary, his literal commentary on Genesis. But look at some of those numbers. Cites John 1, which is very cosmological, 1,000 times. Genesis 1:1, one verse alone gets cited 700 times. Aren't our new recent databases, electronic tools, wonderful? They allow us to discover things. Part of his conversion and formation was sitting in on Ambrose's hexameral sermons. So if any of you have come by and read the sermons of Ambrose on the hexameron, hexameron was a late antique term for describing the days of creation. That was formative in his own conversion. And he worked out key questions. The phrase he didn't talk about creatio ex nihilo, he used factio ex nihilo, to be made out of nothing. And a core formative structure, the way he thought theologically, was this tripartite form of formatio, deformatio, reformatio. That God forms, sin deforms, we're going to come to that with Privation. Sin deforms, and conversion reforms us. And that's really important to understand that substrate to his theology. Notice the continuity. I mean, not only do you have, this is really important for Augustine the Railer, not only do you have the continuity of the word here, formatio, it shows up in each one of these. So you have, and that suggests a theological incoherency of that there is a continuum of being. You know, interestingly, for those of you in theology, you know that there's in terms of the Imago Dei, there are 2 essential ways of, I mean, there are more nuanced versions, but it comes down, when you think about the image of God, you can either take a view that the image was lost at the fall, and Christ brings the image back at salvation, or the second way of thinking about this is the image was marred at the fall and really afflicted, and salvation renews it, restructures it, brings it back, like it was never fully lost, and that there's something of value still there, because God has made us. Well, interestingly, Augustine, there's a big debate about how much this is the case, but Augustine, I think, certainly in the late 390s went through a real transformation of thought as he worked through the Privation issue, as he thought through the problem of evil. And he started out theologically in his earlier years on the side of saying that the image of God was lost at the fall, and Christ brought that back. It's a new kind of addition. It was replacing what was taken away. After by working through this issue of Privation, which I'll come to in a moment, he came to the conclusion, no, the image was marred. It was in terrible shape, and what salvation does is it renews it. And you get that very much in this language of formatio, deformatio, reformatio. There's that kind of continuum built into it. And it's really important for understanding what he's going to do with the doctrine of atonement. He works through this threefold structure. I won't say a lot about this, but he thinks about this. I think the main thing I want to suggest is that for Augustine is the great, if you will, doctor of nature. I'm using doctor here in the medieval sense of the theologian of nature. That he is concerned with the nature and natural world. You know, when you compare him to his sometime mentor Ambrose, when you look at Ambrose's commentaries on Genesis, or his hexameral sermons, rather, excuse me. For Ambrose, why does it rain? Well, obviously, God has sent the rain because we prayed. So he's an occasionalist. God does something in response to us. It rains because God is intended to rain. Maybe our prayers can affect that, but it's God choosing. It will rain or it will not rain. So therefore, we have to pray for it to rain. Augustine rejects that position. And in many ways, we have that to thank for the development of early modern science. As you look at the work of Galileo and others, how much they're working from Augustine on this. Augustine predicates a structure of a natural world, that nature is something that God creates and structures and gives it form in life and a reality, that there's a system, and the system has coherence, and it works, and has its own vitality. Now, God can choose to intervene, but even then it's intervening in a way that's designed according to eternal purposes. I won't get into that. But that there is a coherence, that nature has its own value and vitality because God has created a system that works. There's a continuity, a coherence to nature. And that's really important to understand the way he thinks about reality, that there is a coherence to nature because it's designed by God. Now, as I suggested, you can go look at this. That becomes very important in the development of early modern science. And was a key stepping stone to the development to the science that we all benefit from, in shaping the way people thought about the world, as opposed to a kind of occasionalism that doesn't really allow a place for science. But that's another story. Let's move on to my third main point, and then we'll look at how these come together in his sermons. Well, privatio boni means privation of the good. So the philosophers and theologians who have worked with this may know this phrase. That evil is a lack of good, a loss of what is good. It's a destructive element. So God makes something good, creatio ex nihilo, or factio ex nihilo. God makes something out of nothing, makes it good. It is good because God has made it, not just because God has declared it good, but because God has actually made it good. Now, he's working against the kind of dualistic structure that he was one time a part of as a Manichaean. And he rejects the notion that evil can be its own entity. Evil doesn't exist in its own right. It's not a thing. Where do all things come from? Some of you have studied privation theory, right? Where does a thing come from? If it's a thing, what's its origin? God. So if evil is a thing, who's responsible? It was this sort of teaching that helped drive Augustine from the church as an 18-year-old. It played a role as he grew up within the church, and North African Christianity was highly liberalistic. And Augustine, who was preoccupied with the problem of evil and the nature of good and wanted to protect the goodness of God, you get this rippling throughout the Confessions, concerned to defend the goodness of God, saw a significant problem in the way they were thinking about the nature of evil. And so he redefines it. He takes something that has a certain kind of Neoplatonic base and changes it profoundly. It certainly has a foundation in Plotinus and Neoplaton's tradition, but there's a significant change from what Plotinus does in a way that makes it something wholly new. The evil, then, is this destructive element that undermines the good. But here's the thing. Can an evil completely destroy good? Well, what are we talking about? What is something that's absolutely evil? What is absolute evil in this understanding? Any guesses?
Non-existence.
Non-existence. And is it coherent to talk about non-existence? Right, there's nothing to talk about. Might as well be talking about bananas. You've got nothing to deal with there. So evil is a quality, not a thing. It's a destructive element. It's a bit like, well, the car I have has a lot more plastic on, but even that, it breaks. But I remember my old car. I live in Oxford, which is a pretty wet culture, like we've got here. And the thing about my old car, my VW, was made of metal. And what happens to metal in wet culture? Corrodes. And so the funny thing about my car is the more I drove it, the less I had of it. Evil is this destructive element. It's interesting. Think about how many literary people pick up on this and use it. So how many of you read Madeleine L'Engle? Her great stories. What does she call the forces of evil? Anyone remember? The ecthroi, the unmakers. Tolkien, where do orcs come from? Do you remember? You know this. Privation of elves. It's elves that are twisted. So evil is this twisting. But here's the thing. Can I have this? You don't feel upset when you got this. Here's the thing. So evil kind of destroys something. So we have here a privated poster. What do we have here? Does it have any utility left? Yeah, it's got some utility. This is, by the way, how you understand the city of God. If you're wrestling through what you make of the city of God, this is, if you don't understand privation theory, you don't know what to do. You can't figure out what he's doing in the city of God, or what he's doing in unchristian instruction on hermeneutics, or semiotics. There's this destructive element. Evil has unmade this, but only to an extent, because if it made it completely, there's nothing left to talk about. As long as there's some humanness here, there's something left. There's something of the good left. There's something of value there. Not enough value for salvation of its own right, but something there's coherence to a degree. There's a great incoherence as well. But you can still use it. So you could have chosen to show up here at 7 p.m. for some guy named Rosenberg talking about after all. After all, it's Rosenberg at 7 p.m. And you might have thought this was me. There's Augustine with the book, by the way. You would have gotten some of it right. You've also gotten some of it wrong. And that's what privation does. Is it undermines, and you get some wrong, but there's still something of value there. So that's like in the city of God, when he's working through his political theology. Nope, the tape's gone. Here, and this part. When he's working through his political theology, it's not so much political, more theology, but when he's working through it, he's thinking, why can we share peace? Why can we, even though we can't have true justice in this world, why is there, even if we can't have justitia vera, true justice, why could there still be some justitia, some justice, nonetheless, by degree? Just as you have a degree of me. And so at the core of Augustine's theology is this notion of the provatio boni, that something is undermined, it's afflicted, and so when we come to talk about the role of atonement, there is this movement towards remaking and bringing it back to wholeness, a renewal of wholeness. Now, does Ransom's theory answer how to do this? Not a bit. It doesn't answer the problem. And so you can't understand what he's doing unless you pay attention to it. We have a vitiated nature, natura vitiata, that's corrupted due to this originate act that harms cells and gets handed on. We won't get into the original sin bit here. But to understand the way that it afflicts, it becomes this affliction that can be healed. So that's when I tell you that Augustine started out with this view early on, that the image was lost. When he did this core rethinking about privation theory, which largely happened in the 390s. So a little sidetrack, amongst Augustine scholars, there's a big debate about how much did Augustine change his thinking in the late 390s. So several people, starting with Peter Brown, would argue that there was this intellectual landslide about 396, 397. My soon-to-be colleague Carol Harrison has come out with a book arguing that there was no landslide. Well, actually, because of this, I'm not with Carol on this matter. I think because it's in the 390s that he really thought about privation theory, really put it together, and it transformed the way he approached his whole theological framework. So I think a strong argument is there to be made that there is this massive change in Augustine's thought at this time, and we need to interpret his theology as well in it. So you can't go back to his early writings. Think about all of you guys. You've written stuff over many years. I can think of my first essay I wrote in 4th grade on the duck-billed platypus. I would not like to be held to account for what I wrote in my 4th grade essay. That doesn't represent who I am today. So you will find people who treat Augustine, comparing his writings across a 40-year time span, as if they're all equal and all equally representative of his thought. Is that fair? Not fair to anyone. Augustine makes changes. He grows, he learns. That's why I study Augustine, by the way. It's really fun to learn from somebody who grows. I don't like reading authors who are very static. I don't get as much out of them. It's not a chance for me to grow. So, what does Ransom have to do with Provatio Boni? Not a lot. You get this in so I said in the 390s, it's important, we get this into Confessions. In books 5 to 7, the Confessions play out these changes, he's wrestling through it. And it shows up in his work, De Bono. Oh, Jeff Henry. Great. De Bono, his work on privation. De Bono, I'm just stuttering here, I'm sorry. He has a work of early 400 on this very focus, a short work. And, sorry, I can't remember the English title is on Problem with Evil, Nature and the Nature of Good. So, here, we're going to just get a little bit of the flavor of these quotes. This really plays out this notion of probatio boni. I'll let you read it for yourself. I'm going to take a drink while you do that. Now, I want you to pay close attention to those because we're going to turn to some sermons in a moment. And I want you to see if there's some similar language. So, when you have a privation of good, you have to restore that good. And it's a form of healing. So when you read the Confessions, you're reading about a kind of convalescence. It's odd. He uses the language, healer, of health and convalescence in the Confessions. How many of you have read the Confessions? Glad to see the number of you. The rest of you have your educational path set out before you. He describes Christ as the medic, as the healer. He uses the language of convalescence. It's clear for him that salvation, that there is this initial moment of redemption and change, but conversion is this life of return and this convalescence. And as we live as Christians, we're living as convalescents. It's almost like people who are outpatients. We live needing continuing restoration. He would take a very different position on understanding the nature of righteousness than, say, the Reformers. So the Reformers would talk about righteousness, and this fits in with some of the ideas of declarative justification. They would see righteousness as being something external. So I remember growing up with this theology that righteousness is something like a clothing around us. It's something external. And when God sees us as saved, he sees us through Christ's righteousness. But it's always Christ's righteousness surrounding us. Well, that's not a patristic, certainly, or Augustine's position. Righteousness comes in and it begins this work of transformation, of healing, of renewal, of restoration of image. Here's from his Zen Corinthian. This is the handbook on faith, hope, and charity, which is as close as you get to a systematic overview of Augustine's thought. As close as you get. There isn't an exact. You can sit down and write. Systematics is a modern or a medieval invention. So look at these underlined parts. Again, I'll let you read that for yourself. So, let's turn to the sermons. So here we have Sermon 90, Sermon 90. There are all sorts of interesting and historically reasons based in the history of discovery for how sermons are named. I won't go into that, but Sermon 98. The biblical text continues, who heals all your ills when our ills you see are healed? We won't feel loathing for our bread. So see what comes next once our ills are healed. Who redeems your life from decay. Or this, Christ is the former and reformer of humans, the creator and recreator, the maker and remaker. Sermon 27:6, Christ's deformity is what gives form to you. That almost sounds like the Cappadocians, Athanasius, Irenaeus to a bit almost. Jeff, does that? Julie? This is not something alien to Augustine. This is right in the heart. And here's one of the things, I give you a lot of other sermons, but we're running out of time. We'll give you time for questions. You go to 8:30, is that right? Here's the thing about sermons. Augustine does a lot of sophisticated theology in sermons. Really sophisticated. It's surprising. He even has a set of sermons against Plato, containing Platonism, rather. Sermons 240, 242. Really sophisticated stuff, which is interesting, because you can say, okay, this is why some people say, he has no idea who's in his audience. I think that's not right, because they're paying too much attention to books. But here's the thing. Augustine in his sermons does very sophisticated theology, but I've read a lot of sermons. I can't say I've ever seen him do experimental theology, or constructive theology, if you will. He does that in other places. So in his Genesis commentary, his great Genesis commentary I work on, he tries ideas out. he raises flags up and says, let's try this idea. I'm not sure if it's right. Don't hold me to it. I'm paraphrasing. Let's try this. He never does that in his sermons. He doesn't think that's his place. So what does that tell us? In his sermons, what we have is core theology, core to his thought. So if it shows up in a sermon, and if it shows up multiple times in a sermon, it tells you that this is an important topic. It also tells you, because I'm interested in sermons as a mode of access to popular theology, it also tells you something about what the broader community thought. He's dealing with this, and the way he speaks about it, he's not defending it. He's not really apologetic, like this is going to be a shock. I'm going to shock my audience when I say this. He doesn't speak in that way. He speaks as if that's normative to them. So in terms of late antique theology, Latin theology, Latin patristic, North Africa, which even is sort of much less sophisticated than what you find in other parts of the empire, the Western Empire, you find Deification. He doesn't use the word that I recall in a particular place, but he's got the concept profoundly. He's got this notion of deification built deeply into the DNA, if you will, the substrate of both his theology and the community's theology. He's not having to convince them of it. He's having to, in a sense, pastorally convince them of it. Like, understand this, get it into your mind. But it's not as if getting your mind and what you thought before was wrong, as if he's having to convince them that they had a wrong idea of atonement, that they were doing the funny ransom theory, and he's trying to give them the right sense. This is what they thought. This was the idea of the community, not just the idea of Augustine, because it would show up in his sermons differently if it were something other than that. The other thing to note, I do spend a lot of my time working through questions of oral culture, and one of the things, it's fascinating to deal with this. One of the things about orality is that you find in oral culture that core ideas, important ideas, main ideas get fixed in the mind readily. In terms of memory, those of you who are classicists, go to your quintillion. You get it fixed, but things that are unimportant, minor details, shift. So you find that, for example, when you see recitations of Scripture. So when Augustine is citing Scripture from memory, things that were really important to him, he gets the same every time. Things within the scriptural statement that he didn't pay as much attention to, and didn't care about as much, that just didn't strike him as deeply, were the things that when he recited from memory, he might get wrong in his paraphrase. We all do that, by the way. And so one of the things, by paying attention to oral product, one of the things we have to do is think about how does the oral context, oral culture, shape the way things are thought. One of the things we can do is pay attention to what gets repeated. And if it gets repeated in the same way, you can know that that's actually quite important. So if you see a repetition of an idea over and over again in the same form with largely the same words, think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Then you can say, okay, this is actually a core, important idea. If it shifts a lot, well, it's tertiary, secondary, or tertiary. Well, these ideas show the same kind of language for Augustine on deification shows up in the same form over and over and over again. It's at the core of his thought. He repeats that which is important to him. Here's just a few more rough indications of it. Sorry, let me give you just some of these acronyms. That's Enarrationes ad Psalmos, his enarrations or sermons on the Psalms, and S is for sermon. And I think I had tractatus on there, his tractates or his essays on the Gospel of John. So again, you can see the continuity and how similar that was to some of those texts I had earlier from the Confessions. So by paying attention to sermons, what happened for me? So here's in terms of my own biography. It was paying attention to sermons that made me go back and read his books differently. And what was there to be discovered in his books? What was there to be discovered was actually his books right along. It's just that I was conditioned not to read them the way I should. And I missed something others probably weren't as dense as me. But I missed something that was right there because I was conditioned to think about this in a way that people like Karl Barth and Victor Alun wrote about it. And so I expected Augustine to emphasize ransom theory. So I was glad to see ransom theory. He does talk about ransom theory, by the way. It's part of his thinking, but it's clearly it's just a minor mechanical part of the whole. It's a stepping stone to deificatio. It's a medium of movement, if you will. There's just some more. There are two texts where it shows up particularly, and there's just short paragraphs. De Trinitate 14:12 De Civitate Dei 10:15. So it's work, sorry, let me get the English of that. But, on the Trinity, book 14, chapter 12, and City of God, book 10, chapter 15. For those of you not familiar with ancient works, what often today we call chapters or sections in late antique world were called books. So the City of God is broken up, for example, into 22 books, which we would call a very long chapter or a very long read. He called it his great and arduous work. I also think after having done this work, I reread the Confessions, and actually I realized, or I believe firmly, that the Confessions is driven by this whole vision of Deification. And it's there to be read. And if you understand it, it's interwoven. It's part of the warp and woof of the work. And the way he thinks about conversion as convalescence is built into that. But again, I had to change my framework. I had to look at the whole board. I had to get to context to be able to understand that. So, summary. I think sermons are indicative of normative teaching. Pay attention to his preaching. And actually, if I had my way, we would go to Augustine first via sermons, and then from sermons go to the books. You let the sermons define the way we read his books, not the books define the way we read his sermons. Because it's clear that his sermons were his most important and most extensive product. Creation out of nothing, as shaped by his cosmology, implies this position. This, if you don't pay attention to his cosmology, you miss something. Deification fits the cosmology. Utterly, completely. It's a tight, neat fit. And finally, the privation theory. It's a tight, neat fit. It solves the problem of the privation of evil, whereas ransom theory does not. It would be, the systematicians should have a heyday with him, critiquing him for holding ransom theory and privation theory, unless he doesn't really hold ransom theory that much. And I think it's time to rethink that, and we understand that. It's also worth knowing, and I can't remember the name of the author, there are a group of people who are actually going back and saying that Luther and Calvin didn't hold ransom theory as much as we think they did, and they were actually held aspects of Deificatio. I haven't read these, but I did this lecture just very recently, and I had someone there as a Reformation scholar point out. Actually, I was talking to my colleague Alistair McGrath was pointing this out to me as well. Just recently we were talking about it. So summary, final summary. Pay attention. So here's spectacular paintings. How many Christian college marketing campaigns has this image shown up of the School of Athens? So here's the Raphael rooms. How many of you have been through the Raphael rooms in the Vatican? A few of you? They're spectacular paintings, amazing paintings on two sides of the room. The room, these particular set of paintings, this room you walk through. And on one side is the very well-known School of Athens that everybody sees and uses. On the other side is the other critically important but less well-known Disputa, which is the Disputation on the Sacrament. And in it, you have both the oral going on. So there's, I'm not sure which patristic character that's supposed to be, or medieval character, in declamation. He's obviously doing something oral there. But then here's Augustine. And what's he doing? He's writing books and giving direction on books. And that's Raphael again. I think Raphael got it wrong. The image I'd like to leave you with is the other great Renaissance image artist, Bernini. His statues at the back, when you look at the high altar at the back of St. Peter's, the Vatican, he's got the four doctors of the church, the four Latin doctors. And Augustine's one, and there's Augustine, the preachers, and this is the symbol of declamation, of proclaiming, preaching. I think Bernini got it right. He's the one we should pay attention. It's not that Augustine was not a man of books; it's that he was a man of words, of which books happen to be one of the medium, but not the only medium, and maybe not even the most important medium. Let me leave it there and turn over to you for criticism.
Thank you. I will let you field the questions.
One at a time, not all together.
Over here, and then over here.
Yeah, does Augustine talk about the means of deification and how those serve to deify us?
He does so. Now, this is an important doctrine to Augustine. He doesn't have the level of sophistication of the Cappadocians. He hasn't. I don't want to suggest that he is just as good as Nazianzus on this. He hasn't. He doesn't have the level of development. But it is clear that he thinks about the righteousness comes within and has this transformative effect, and it's back to that language of reformatio. For Augustine, conversion is a lifetime experience of return to God. It has a moment. There is a moment of return where the return begins, and to use modern post-Billy Sunday language, we can say that's the moment of salvation. But it's this return, this restoration that begins, and he thinks of it as a reformatio, and it's this continuing transformation of grace internally. And he thinks of, it's very clear he works in terms of a notion of intrinsic righteousness rather than extrinsic. I'm not sure if that
That's
is
helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. In Augustine's thought, what is the relationship between formation and reformation? And part of what I'm getting at is, like when you use the model of convalescence, you have, you're well and then you get sick and you get better again. And even a couple slides back, you had the idea that reformation is the returning back to and getting again what was lost in the Privation. And yet, what that reminds me of is certain strains of Protestant theology, which talk about, what is the goal of redemption? It's to return to the garden. Whereas in biblical theology, I think it's better to say that history starts in a garden, but it ends in a garden city. That eschatology is not the same thing as protology.
Sure.
There's a development even beyond the original image. What do we see in Paul's language in Romans about image? It's that we're not just being conformed to the image of God, but to the image of the crucified and risen Christ, which is something that goes above and beyond what we had originally. So would there be a recognition of that?
Yes, so for Augustine, it's out of Augustine that people sometimes talk about the felix culpa, the happy mistake, it's more than a mistake, isn't it? the happy tragedy, that there's a benefit to it. So for Augustine, he goes into this both in his commentary in Genesis, it shows up in the City of God, a notion that had Adam and Eve persisted in grace, had they enjoyed and held on to the grace and not rejected it, that they would have then received a further additional grace that would have made fast them in that state, if you will. And by acting preemptively as they did, they interrupted God's divine process, and so they didn't receive the fullness of grace. And so he sees the salvation. So there's a fourth stage that sometimes comes up, and it comes out in the Anti-Pelagian works as well. A fourth stage of glorification or consummation. And it's out of that the Reformed tradition sometimes talks about creation, fall, redemption, consummation. I mean, that's very much an Augustinian framework in some sense. I think some of the Reformed folks cast it more in their own image than Augustine's image when they describe Augustine on this, but it's understood. So there is this sense that we go on to something better. So he thinks that in the future we will have something greater than what Adam and Eve had. That the end of all times, the eschaton will see us with a new added grace. And in addition, we've enjoyed the amazing grace of the crucifixion. And so the crucifixion gives us something that was not available in terms of grace. It's not available to Adam and Eve, so we get that. And then in completion, we'll have even a further grace that they never received, but should have had they persisted. So he does see a continued movement beyond that. Yeah.
Along those same lines, it struck me as interesting in a talk on deification to hear you emphasize Augustine as an anti-occasionalist and everything that contributes to science, because along those same lines, feels like those emphases might at least be in tension with one another a little bit, whereas deification typically is that raising up above our nature, whereas at the same time emphasizing the natural cosmology there. Can you help me out maybe a little with that tension of how to strike those two chords?
I'd like to,
alongside
but
one
I'm
another?
not sure I see the tension myself. So push that further out. Help me. I might be missing something here.
When I hear deification along the line with that question, I'm typically thinking in a raising up, that Jesus in becoming human is raising us up above the created human nature that we might see in the garden or somewhere. There's an added element, whether it was a natural outgrowth from that nature or an actual elevation.
Okay, thank you. I think I see the direction of play there. Let me try. You can tell me if I've gotten it right. Let's take some constituent parts. Let's pull out some of the constituent parts. For Augustine, the first thing is, what do we think about the order of the natural world? And does the natural world have any benefit or value in its own right? So it's important to remember that for Augustine, the saeculum has a benefit because it's the saeculum. The founding fathers understood something. We don't get the saeculum means often now. The founding fathers in the U.S. actually did. It shows up in the motto, Novus Ordo Saeculorum, the new order of the ages. So saeculum means something like space and time. It's the near Latin equivalent to cosmos. And so it's that which God has made that is both place and time. And as such, it has a kind of integrity gifted to it by God so that it can work. Now, we're not talking about a blind watchmaker sort of integrity, but it has a structure and a wholeness. Now, at the same time, for Augustine, that structure and wholeness is not the whole of reality. So reality transforms it. So I think what we want to be able to say is that there are parts of reality that God creates a reality that works. And that reality has benefits. That reality also brings pain. One of the things that's very interesting is for Augustine, I think it's quite clear that we don't look at physical problems in the universe, like earthquakes, as being a result of the fall. I grew up thinking that that's what Augustine meant. And actually, Augustine doesn't. With George knows, we've been working on this one quite a bit in terms of relation between privation and his view of the natural world. It's a structure that has a coherence to it, and that structure might create pain for us sometimes. But for Augustine, the beauty and the good is actually in the whole and the part. This goes back to, this is where he's picked up some Stoic thought. So Stoics would distinguish between the whole and the part on things. And something that you look at in the microscope, in part, may look bad or difficult or problematic. That earthquake that struck and hurt these people is bad and difficult in part, but if you can look at it in the whole structure of reality, it's got its place. So we've got to sort of put it, say, for example, in the way we understand issues and work with them. We have an atmosphere that works because of the way the Earth is made, which includes a nickel core that spins. If you have a nickel core that spins, you're going to have continents that move. If you have continents that move, you're going to have earthquakes. So we have a structure of reality, of a physical world that works. And if we only look narrowly down at one piece of it, we might interpret it as being bad. You have to step back and by seeing it in its whole mosaic, I think mosaic's a good image here for this, you can begin to see the benefit of the good. And so part of the mosaic for Augustine is, while there is a structure that makes sense and has a vitality of its own, it's not the whole of reality. And so there is a spiritual reality that transcends the particular physical. But you don't need to have recourse to that spiritual for every aspect of the physical. And so you can describe certain physical aspects in their own right and let them stand in their own right without necessarily recourse to spiritual at every moment. But yet, nonetheless, there is the spiritual that transcends it and can speak it, enter into it. Does that answer your...
No, that's helpful to spell out a little bit more how they fit together.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was a long-winded response.
Could you speak to, this may be far afield, but to agency in conversion for Augustine?
Yeah.
I know, but can we
Oh boy, that is a soup question. You know,
was the famous
soup question
quote-
means it's something that should come at the beginning at the meal. And now we'll have 2 more hours.
No, I mean, so I'm thinking of the what to me is a standout quote from the Confession is, for thou hast converted me unto thyself.
Mm.
He writes a book on free will, but I haven't interacted with his sermons at all. I'm wondering how he preached on agency. If you can give me a direction there. Or if I should just go with it.
Just go with it. No. I'm going to give it because that's a question that merits a lot more than what I can give in this moment. But let me just give you a little mini goblet, a little bit of a response. But we should both know that what I'm going to give you doesn't, your question merits more than what I'm giving you. Or we should all know. Excuse me. Well, you have, of course, Augustine, beginning, you have to also ask when with Augustine.
Yeah.
Augustine changes. So let's talk in terms of the later Augustine. You have to, of course, bring into this the notion of predestination, and that God determines by his own, for his own purposes, in a way that's unscrutable to human understanding, human purposes. There's determination of salvation by God. Now, one thing that's important to remember for Augustine is its single determination. Calvin will come along and do double. That is, God determines some to be saved, some to be damned. For Augustine, there was just a mass of damned, the mass of those who were fallen. And God, for reasons only known to God, chooses some to be saved. So the first thing in terms of the question of agency is that for mature Augustine, we're talking period after roughly 411 and 413, that transition period, that God has chosen. Now, interestingly, here's one of the problems with dealing with sermons. It's almost impossible to date most of the sermons. You guys you have to disbelieve a work that George has bought for the center. He's got a wonderful translation set of Augustine in the center, the works of Augustine for the 21st century. A great gift to all of us that these translations came out. Interestingly, some of those are translating sermons that came out in 1990s that had never been translated in English before. That tells you, in terms of this issue of how we pay attention to sermons, you get an idea of priority by translations when they come out. Well, sermons were largely ignored for translations, so that's just going to put that up as one of the points. Those sermons, which are truly a gift, so I'm grateful we have them, in there, if you go look at those, you will see each one giving a date for them. In about 98% of the cases, disregard the date. Unless there's a lot of work has come out on this. If you're interested in this issue, you better just Throbner, who's written extensively on it and is, I think, utterly trustworthy on this. Along with another French scholar, Rosenberg. Most of the dating we can't trust. So when you look at a sermon, so here's the problem. He has sermons that invite as if it's human agency. Don't know if those are early or late. That's the problem. Some of them could be late. Now, I think Augustine preaches in a way of trying to grab them. So he certainly never preaches, well, it's all up to God, so maybe he'll be with us, maybe he won't be with us. Here's another point. Oh, sorry, I left out one interesting bit about sermons in terms of emphases. Do you know how often Augustine preached on Pelagianism? 950 sermons available. How many of those do you think, based on how important most people would say Pelagian debate was, how often did he preach on Pelagianism? 5 sermons named Pelagius out of 950. Does that sound like a critical debate core to all of Augustine's thought? Now, it is a case within late antique rhetoric that people would sometimes, and we get this today as well, people might have a position that they're arguing against, but they won't name the person. So when you look at what can clearly and forcefully be defined as anti-Pelagian rhetoric, you can add maybe another 20 sermons. So we're at 25 out of 950. But then you say, well, there are only 950 sermons extant, and he told us Rosenberg there are at least 4,000, so he could be missing one. Well, that's true. But normal social theory that we work with, social science theory, is useful here. That is, we say when there's a large data set to work with, you treat it as being representative until you find alternative evidence. And so the data set tells us that Augustine didn't think Pelagian
issues where predestination was an important thing for preaching. It doesn't show up in his preaching hardly at all. So I think, what I can say to your question is, these sermons represent the broad range of teaching. I don't know, I can't point, I'm not confident pointing one and saying, well, this certainly represents what he preaches on during the Pelagian debate. There might be a few. There are a few sermons where he will refer to a historic event we know of, and so we can firmly date it as being out of But in terms of looking at with a good science theory in mind, numerous of these would have been during the Pelagian debate, and none of them does he treat it as, preach on it in a way that suggests people don't have a choice.
Sure.
So he just doesn't engage them with it.
It's one of those particular issues you reminded me of when you said, reading Augustine through the lens of Reformation thought. That's a particular one that kind of gets dragged through the mud. So.
Yeah. Time for a final question, or should we end there? Yeah.
We're talking about theosis then. Do you think this one talks a lot about beauty and the ultimate beatitude?
Yeah, you're right.
So is that kind of connection?
Oh, deeply, yeah. You're absolutely right to make that connection. That's a clever recognition. For Augustine, you may know this, but in the late antique world, beauty, truth, goodness, moral rightness, all of these are interrelated. You can't separate something. This is why Augustine distrusted the Bible early on, because I don't know how many of you know Greek or Latin. You read the old Latin text. I mean, the Greek Bible alone is bad Greek. And then you look at the early Latin translations of it, it's really, really bad Latin. It had no, and he's somebody who's trained in Cicero, this glorious rhetoric. And beautiful words in a culture of beauty and wholeness and restoration. And so he fled from Christianity in part over its lack of beauty. This is books 2 to 4 of the Confession. The scriptures themselves weren't beautiful. If they weren't beautiful, they must not be true. So beauty is really important in all this, and you're right to see that.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.